The interdiction intelligence had been building for 9 days. It began as a fragment, a signals collection product that identified a specific encrypted communications pattern between a Quds Force logistics node in Chabahar and a vessel registry address associated with a shell company registered in the Comoros Islands. The fragment was cross-referenced against satellite imagery from 3 consecutive passes over Chabahar's eastern pier facilities, which showed a vessel of approximately 3,400 gross tons taking on cargo through a covered loading operation that used a warehouse transit configuration specifically designed to prevent overhead optical characterization of what was being moved from the warehouse floor to the hold. The third intelligence input arrived from a human source whose access to the relevant networks had been assessed as reliable on 14 previous occasions. The cargo was a consignment of Dehlavieh anti-tank guided missile systems, 2-fan rocket launchers, and a quantity of 122mm artillery rockets whose production markings would trace them to an IRGC Aerospace Force facility outside Isfahan. The destination was a Houthi logistics reception point on the Yemeni Red Sea coast. The transit route ran south through the Gulf of Oman and into the Arabian Sea before turning west toward the Gulf of Aden and the Bab el-Mandeb Strait. Fifth Fleet's interdiction authorization came through the command chain at 11:44 p.m. The legal basis was the UN Security Council arms embargo on Yemen, which had been in continuous effect since 2015, and which authorized member states to inspect vessels on the high seas when there were reasonable grounds to believe they were carrying arms in violation of the embargo. The intelligence package assembled over 9 days provided reasonable grounds with a confidence level that the legal review team had assessed as the strongest evidentiary basis for a maritime interdiction operation in the Arabian Sea in more than 2 years. The authorization was granted. The USS guided missile destroyer, already positioned 140 nautical miles southeast of Chabahar, was assigned as the interdiction asset and directed to intercept the vessel, designated Target Vessel Alpha, at a point in the international waters of the Arabian Sea, approximately 280 nautical miles south of the Iranian coastline. The interdiction itself was clinically efficient. The boarding team went over the side at 3:17 a.m. in calm seas under a sky just beginning to lose its deepest darkness in the east. Target Vessel Alpha's master did not resist, whether from professional pragmatism, advanced knowledge that resistance was not an option under the circumstances, or simple recognition that the USS destroyer positioned 600 yards off his beam with a boarding team already in the water was a geometrical argument without a viable counter-response. He complied with the boarding team's instructions and permitted access to the hold manifest documentation and the sealed cargo containers in the forward holds. The weapons were where the intelligence said they would be. The Dehlavieh systems were in factory packaging. The rocket propellant charges for the artillery rounds had been separated from the warhead sections, but were present and accounted for in adjacent containers. The manifest listed the cargo as agricultural equipment. The boarding team commander transmitted his cargo confirmation to the destroyer at 3:44 a.m. The prize crew transfer was completed by 4:02 a.m. The destroyer's commanding officer transmitted the interdiction confirmation to Fifth Fleet at 4:04 a.m. and received acknowledgement at 4:09 a.m., along with a transit authorization to bring Target Vessel Alpha to the Combined Maritime Forces custody point at Djibouti. At 4:11 a.m., the surface plot changed. 3 contacts appeared simultaneously on the destroyer's radar at bearings spanning from 017 degrees to 041 degrees, ranges between 44 and 52 nautical miles, all moving south at speeds between 29 and 33 knots. The contact spacing and the bearing distribution, 3 vessels spread across a 24-degree azimuth arc, all departing the Iranian coastline at approximately the same moment, all on converging headings with the destroyer's current position, produced a tactical picture that required no analysis to interpret. The IRGC Navy's response to the interdiction had been triggered the moment the boarding team's radio traffic confirmed the seizure. 3 fast attack craft departing simultaneously from different points along the southern Iranian coast, organized in a spread formation rather than a column, configured for exactly the swarm geometry that IRGC doctrine specified for harassment of U.S. Navy interdiction operations in the Arabian Sea. The watch supervisor designated the contacts Track Lima 1, Track Lima 2, and Track Lima 3. Classification confirmed within 4 minutes, 2 Osa-II class missile boats and 1 Hendijan class fast patrol vessel. Combined weapons loadout across the 3 contacts included 8 P-15 Termit anti-ship missiles in above-deck launchers on the 2 Osa-IIs, missiles whose effective engagement range at the current contact distance would place the destroyer inside their firing envelope within approximately 78 minutes at the contact's current closing speed. The Hendijan carried no dedicated anti-ship missiles, but was equipped with deck-mounted torpedo tubes and a forward gun mount that had been used in previous documented IRGC interdiction harassment operations. The commanding officer was at the plot by 4:14 a.m. He had been in his sea cabin immediately below the bridge since the prize crew transfer, maintaining immediate availability during the transition phase of the interdiction operation, when the tactical picture was most likely to develop additional variables. He reviewed the contact geometry with the economy of assessment that comes from having briefed himself thoroughly on IRGC interdiction response doctrine before the operation began, and from having specifically wargamed a 3-vessel response scenario with his tactical action officer during the transit to the interdiction point. The scenario had been rated as the most probable response profile given the IRGC's documented pattern of reacting to Arabian Sea interdiction operations with fast attack craft deployments sized to create harassment pressure without crossing the threshold of unambiguous hostile action under international law. 3 vessels, approaching in a spread formation from bearings that bracketed the destroyer's current heading without directly threatening the prize vessel. It was the scenario they had briefed, and it was developing exactly as briefed. He had 3 decisions to make immediately before the geometry closed further. First, the prize vessel. Target vessel Alpha was now in U.S. custody and required protection as well as escort. Its crew of 14, all Azerbaijani nationals who had been secured in their accommodations by the prize crew, were not combatants, and the vessel they were aboard was now the most logistically vulnerable element in the tactical picture. A fast attack craft that bypassed the destroyer and pressed toward the prize vessel had a different engagement calculus than one that directly challenged the warship. The commanding officer directed the prize crew commander to have target vessel Alpha increase to its maximum sustainable speed, 11.4 knots, and alter heading to a bearing that opened its distance from the approaching contacts, rather than maintaining its current heading toward Djibouti. Speed and heading were available to the prize vessel. Distance was its primary defensive resource. Second, the MH-60R Seahawk. The helicopter had been airborne for the boarding operation and had 51 minutes of remaining fuel endurance. The commanding officer directed it to close the lead contact, Track Lima 1, the nearest Osa-II, and establish an overhead surveillance and laser designation posture at 350 feet. The remaining 51 minutes of endurance would cover the most critical phase of the geometry development. Third, communications. The communications officer transmitted on Channel 16 and all Arabian Sea safety frequencies in Farsi and English at 4:16 a.m., identifying the destroyer, declaring the prize vessel status as a vessel under lawful interdiction pursuant to UN Security Council Resolution 2216, and warning all approaching vessels that interference with the custody transit would be met with all lawful means available under applicable rules of engagement. The transmission was precise, legally grounded, and transmitted 4 times over the following 12 minutes. No response came from any of the 3 approaching contacts. The silence was the same organized, deliberate absence of communication that the IRGC employs when it wants the geometry to speak without creating an evidentiary record of intent. 3 vessels closing in a spread formation on a U.S. Navy destroyer executing a lawful interdiction transit, making no radio contact, carrying 8 anti-ship missiles at ranges that would become tactically relevant within the next hour. The silence made each of those facts more rather than less significant. At 4:28 a.m., the electronic warfare suite registered active emissions from Track Lima 1. The contact's pot drum targeting radar, the surface search and acquisition radar associated with the P-15 missile system, had activated and was operating in acquisition mode, its beams sweeping the surface picture around it with the specific scan pattern that preceded active fire control solution development. Not yet a fire control lock. An acquisition sweep. A system being warmed up and exercised in a way that made its operational readiness legible to every electronic intelligence sensor in the area. The tactical action officer logged the emission at 4:28 and 9 seconds a.m. and reported it to the commanding officer without additional commentary, because the report itself contained all the relevant content. A P-15 acquisition radar active on an Osa-II missile boat closing at 31 knots was not ambiguous information. It was a specific and precisely characterizable data point whose implications were fully contained in its description. At 4:31 a.m., the Seahawk established its overhead position on track Lima-1 at 340 feet. The laser designator locked onto the Osa-II's launcher deck and bridge structure at 4:31:44 a.m. The beam held its dual solution, launcher deck and bridge simultaneously, with the stability that the targeting system maintained through the helicopter's motion and through the thermal turbulence above the warm Arabian Sea surface. Track Lima-1's own electro-optical defensive systems registered the laser energy within 7 seconds of activation. The crew aboard that vessel understood what they were being told in the language of laser wavelengths. A targeting solution exists on your most critical systems and is being held by a platform you cannot engage without weapons employment that would cross the threshold of unambiguous hostile action in front of multiple sensor systems that are recording everything. Track Lima-1's pot drum radar shut down at 4:32 and 1 seconds a.m., 17 seconds after the laser solution was established. Track Lima-II, observing the lead vessel's electronic behavior shift on its own collection systems, had not yet activated its own targeting radar. It maintained its closing speed and heading without adjustment, its electronic picture clean of any fire control emissions. Track Lima-III, the Hendijan patrol vessel, had been maintaining a trailing position 8 nautical miles behind the two Osa-IIs throughout the approach and had not deviated from that positioning. At 4:37 a.m., the geometry reached its most compressed phase. Track Lima-I was at 19.4 nautical miles. Track Lima-II at 22.1 nautical miles. Track Lima-III at 28.7 nautical miles. The combined approach of the three contacts had been moving for 26 minutes since their initial appearance on the radar, and the positions at 4:37 a.m. placed them inside the outer boundary of the P-15 missile's engagement envelope against the destroyer's current position. The P-15 has an effective range of approximately 40 nautical miles in its baseline guidance configuration. Track Lima-I at 19.4 nautical miles was inside that envelope. Track Lima-II at 22.1 nautical miles was inside that envelope. The pot drum radar on track Lima-I had been shut down since 4:32 a.m. Without an active targeting solution being maintained by the launch platform, executing a missile engagement was significantly more complex, not impossible for a crew with sufficient training and situational awareness, but meaningfully more difficult than a launch from an active lock. The commanding officer authorized the next response step at 4:38 a.m. The AN/SLQ-32 activated and targeted jamming mode against the frequency bands associated with the P-15 missile system's terminal guidance architecture, not the launch platform's targeting radar, which was already offline, but the radio frequency uplink channel that the P-15 uses for mid-course correction updates during its terminal flight phase. The jamming was preemptive rather than reactive. If a P-15 was launched from track Lima-I without its pot drum radar providing an active lock, the missile would rely more heavily on its mid-course uplink for course correction. The jamming targeted that uplink. It was a message in the language of electronic warfare. We have anticipated your fallback option, and we have addressed it. The option you are considering has already been reduced in effectiveness by a system that identified it before you exercised it. At 4:41 a.m., track Lima-II activated its own pot drum radar. The activation was brief, 4 acquisition sweeps lasting a total of 9.2 seconds before the system shut down without transition to fire control mode. The electronic warfare officer logged the 4 sweeps and their duration and assessed them as a system test rather than a targeting sequence. Insufficient time in acquisition mode to develop a refined solution, consistent with a crew checking their system's operational status rather than beginning an engagement sequence. The Seahawk redirected its laser designator from track Lima-1 to track Lima-2 at 4:42 a.m., establishing a new dual solution on the second Osa-II's launcher deck and bridge. The transition took 11 seconds. The laser was active on track Lima-2 at 4:42 and 11 seconds a.m. Track Lima-2's pot drum did not reactivate. At 4:44 a.m., the commanding officer directed the destroyer to alter its own heading 22 degrees to the south, not a withdrawal, a course adjustment that reduced the destroyer's beam-on profile to the approaching contacts while maintaining a closing geometry with the prize vessel's position ahead. The heading change accomplished 2 tactical objectives simultaneously. It reduced the destroyer's radar cross-section from track Lima-1's bearing by presenting a narrower hull aspect to any targeting sensor the contact might reactivate, and it repositioned the destroyer on a heading that gave it more direct alignment with the prize vessel's track, shortening the response time if any of the IRGC contacts attempted to redirect toward target vessel Alpha rather than the warship. Track Lima-3, the Hendajan patrol vessel, had been closing steadily from its trailing position without activating any weapon systems. At 4:46 a.m., it was at 21.3 nautical miles. Its heading had not deviated from its initial approach bearing, and its speed had not changed from the 29 knots it had maintained since departure. It was the one contact that had done nothing that registered as a measurable escalation, no radar activation, no course change, no communication. It was simply present, closing, and watching. At 4:48 a.m., track Lima-1 reduced speed from 33 knots to 24 knots, then to 17 knots over a 90-second deceleration period that was visible on the radar as a flattening of the contact's closure rate against the destroyer's position. The speed reduction was the first behavioral change in any of the 3 contacts since their initial appearance on the radar 37 minutes earlier, and it registered on the tactical plot with the significance of a variable that had been static for 37 minutes, suddenly becoming dynamic. A missile boat that reduces speed during an approach has made a calculation about whether the approach serves its operational objectives at the current geometry. Track Lima-1's commanding officer had assessed his situation. Laser designation active on his launcher deck, mid-course uplink jammed, Seahawk overhead documenting everything at 340 feet, a U.S. Navy destroyer at 18.1 nautical miles with its weapon systems in active standby, and had made the calculation that 33 knots toward that geometry did not serve the objectives his command had assigned him. Track Lima. 2 reduced speed at 4:51 a.m. from 31 knots to 21 knots. The second Osa-II's deceleration matched the pattern set by the first, not a sharp emergency stop, a gradual reduction that maintained forward motion while converting from an approach speed to a loitering speed. At 20 nautical miles and decelerating, track Lima-2 was transitioning from intercept to presence. Track Lima-3 maintained 29 knots for another 4 minutes, before also reducing to 22 knots at 4:55 a.m. at a range of 18.6 nautical miles. All 3 contacts were now in the range band between 17.8 and 21.4 nautical miles, all decelerating, none of them on active approach vectors, none of them in communications with the destroyer or with any monitored frequency, and none of them withdrawing. They were hovering. 3 IRGC vessels at ranges between 17 and 22 nautical miles, holding position in a spread arc to the north and northeast of the destroyer, maintaining a presence that was close enough to constitute continued tactical pressure and far enough to remain outside the threshold geometry where the destroyer's existing engagement authorities would have been clearly satisfied. It was the IRGC's preferred fallback posture when a direct approach failed to achieve its objectives. Transition to observed presence, document the American position and behavior, remain in the area long enough to establish that the IRGC had not simply been driven away, but had chosen a different engagement mode. The commanding officer accepted this transition and made no attempt to drive the contacts further. Driving them further would have required maneuvering the destroyer toward 3 armed contacts in a way that would complicate the geometry of protecting the prize vessel and would have redirected the destroyer's attention and positioning away from its primary obligation. Target vessel Alpha was at 31 nautical miles to the south, making 11.4 knots on its new heading, with its prize crew maintaining the vessel's systems and its master still secured in his accommodations. The destroyer's primary task was to keep that vessel and its cargo moving south toward Djibouti. The 3 IRGC contacts maintaining a loitering presence to the north were a secondary consideration that required monitoring, but not additional action. The prize vessel continued south. The destroyer held its screening position. The 3 IRGC contacts held their arc at 17 to 22 nautical miles. This geometry lasted 63 minutes. At 5:58 a.m., track Lima 1 turned north. A gradual course change that opened its range from the destroyer at a slow rate, the turn of a vessel that has completed its assigned observation task and is returning to base rather than responding to an immediate threat or tactical imperative. Track Lima 2 followed 11 minutes later. Track Lima 3 turned north at 6:21 a.m., the last of the 3 contacts to begin its withdrawal and the one that maintained the nearest position to the destroyer throughout the loitering phase. By 6:31 a.m., all 3 contacts had opened to ranges beyond 35 nautical miles and were on northbound headings toward the Iranian coastline. The tactical picture around the destroyer and the prize vessel was clear. Target vessel Alpha reached the CTF-151 custody handoff point at 4:47 p.m., 16 hours and 43 minutes after the boarding team had first gone over its side in the pre-dawn Arabian Sea. The weapons cargo, the Dehlavieh systems, the rocket launchers, the artillery rounds, was formally logged into the evidence chain at the custody point and would eventually be processed through the legal framework of the UN embargo enforcement mechanism. The Azerbaijani crew were released to the custody of their flag state's maritime authority through the standard consular notification process. The engagement report compiled at 7:30 a.m. documented the IRGC response with the precision the record required. 3 contacts, total engagement duration from first radar appearance to final withdrawal, 2 hours and 20 minutes. Maximum closing speed achieved by any contact, 33 knots. Minimum range achieved by track Lima 1 before speed reduction, 17.8 nautical miles. P-15 pot drum radar activations, track Lima 1 activation duration 23 minutes before shutdown under laser designation. Track Lima 2, 1 brief activation of 9.2 seconds. AN/SLQ32 jamming, 1 activation against P-15 mid-course uplink frequencies, duration 47 minutes. Seahawk laser designation active, track Lima 1 for 11 minutes 17 seconds, track Lima 2 for 6 minutes 44 seconds. 0 weapons fired. 0 course deviations from the planned interdiction transit route by the destroyer. 0 interference with the prize vessel's southbound transit. The costs were modest in material terms and significant in operational terms. The Seahawk crew had extended their sortie to 6 hours and 12 minutes by the time they recovered aboard, consuming their reserve fuel margin and requiring a maintenance cycle before their next tasking. The AN/SLQ32 had been in active jamming mode for 47 minutes, within normal operating parameters, but requiring a thermal verification cycle. No munitions expended. No damage sustained. The weapons cargo that had been loaded at Chabahar under a covered transit operation designed to prevent overhead optical characterization of its contents was now in custody, logged against the UN embargo framework, and would not reach the Houthi logistics network it had been consigned to. The anti-tank systems that would not arrive in Yemen, the rocket launchers that would not be offloaded at a Red Sea coastal point, the artillery rounds that would not be distributed to forward positions. These were the operational product of 9 days of intelligence assembly and 1 boarding team in the dark at 3:17 a.m. The IRGC had sent 3 armed vessels to contest the outcome. It had found a destroyer that documented their approach, jammed their missile guidance architecture before they could use it, placed a laser on their launcher decks from 340 feet overhead, and maintained its screening position on the prize vessel without diverting from its primary task for 2 hours and 20 minutes. 3 contacts. 2 hours and 20 minutes. 1 pot drum radar shut down in 17 seconds. 1 prize cargo in custody. 0 weapons fired. 0 shipments delivered. The Arabian Sea does not care what the cargo was or where it was going. It moves whatever the vessels on it carry, and the vessels on it carry what the operators aboard them are willing to fight to deliver. On this morning, the operators willing to fight harder were the ones who boarded in the dark at 3:17 a.m., held their position through an IRGC response that placed armed missile boats inside their engagement range, and brought the prize to Djibouti on schedule. The cargo does not arrive. The record says why.